All right, we're back with Proclus and his commentary on the Timaeus. I have a new setup this week, so I'm just going to post in the chat. Let me know if there are issues with this stream, please, on a new setup. Okay, so last week we looked at the archetype of beautiful things being eternal and not as beautiful or imperfectly beautiful things being generated. So the lemma was about the eternal archetype. Now we're moving on. The next quote here. So this is Timaeus speaking in the text. Let therefore this universe be denominated by us all heaven, or the world, or whatever other appellation it may be especially adapted to receive. Okay, so Proclus. I've been trying to change my pronunciation for like a month, and it's not sticking. But all right, so this is the last of the axioms, giving a name to the subject of discussion conformably to geometricians when they speak about the nomon in parallelograms. For they say any one thing consisting of two complements is to be called a nomon. For since Plato intends to call the same thing both heaven and the world, in order that you may not think he disturbs the doctrine by employing at different times different names, he previously determined something about the names. For it must be observed that these names had great ambiguity with the ancients, some of them calling the sublunary region alone the world, but the region above it heaven, but others denominating heaven a part of the world, and some defining it to extend as far as to the moon, but others calling the summits of generation heaven. This is from the Iliad. The widespread heaven and ether and the clouds fell to the lot of Jove. Hence, Plato very properly determines concerning these names, prior to the whole theory, calling the universe heaven and the world, and saying all heaven, that you may not fancy, he says, a divine body alone is denominated by us the world, or by whatever other name it may rejoice to be called. Okay. So, being clear that all heaven does not indicate the heavens occupying one part, or, that the sublunary region is not to be included in the world definition, but okay. And it seems indeed that he calls the universe heaven, conformably to the opinion of all men, but the world according to his own opinion. For he says, let it be called by us heaven and the world. For the name of world is adapted to it as a certain fabrication. Though it is also, so world is probably cosmos, and heaven, I'm not sure. What's Aristotle's title on the, doesn't he have one on the heavens? But let me just get the Greek term for heavens. Urania, like after Uranus, god of the heavens. Possibly. Okay. For the name of world is adapted to it as a certain fabrication, though it is also possible to call it both heaven and the world. Heaven, indeed, as beholding the things above. This is asserted in the Cratylus with the etymology of heaven, as surveying the intelligible and as participating of an intellectual essence, but the world as being always filled and adorned by truly existing beings. So I think it is cosmos and Uranos, or whatever the particular form of that, the world, cosmos, means adornment by truly existing beings. Also arrangement or order. It may also be called heaven as being converted to its principle, but the world as proceeding from it. Okay, so calling the universe all heaven as in reference to where it's coming from, its intelligible paradigm, which it reverts to, and then the world, the adorning and arranging as the activity of the demiurge going outward. For it is generated by and is converted to real being. But as of statues established by the telestic art, some things pertaining to them are manifest, but others are inwardly concealed, being symbolical of the presence of the gods, and which are only known to the mystic artists themselves. Okay, so of these statues, idols, some are manifest, but others are inwardly concealed, being symbolical of the presence of the gods, and which are only known to the mystic artists themselves, after the same manner the world being a statue of the intelligible and perfected by the Father, has indeed some things which are visible in indications of its divinity. So the reference here is probably to the Symposium, where Alcibiades is praising Socrates and compares him to one of the statues of Silenius, which would look like they were made of wood, and then they would have an inner chamber where there was some kind of precious metal version of the statue. So with Socrates, this outward appearance, which is not so impressive, but then like you discover this kind of true gold on the inside. So that's probably the reference. And there's no evidence. I just happened to be looking at something related to Pseudo Dionysius that is in reference to this same passage from the Symposium. There's no archaeological evidence from late antiquity that shows that statues like that were actually made. Instead, it's a literary reference that has just continued in the tradition, despite the actual practice of making that particular sort of statue having died out. So, but as the statues established by the telestic art, some things pertaining to them are manifest, but others are inwardly concealed. Or maybe there were statues we just don't know about specifically what sorts they were, being symbolical of the presence of the gods, and which are only known to the mystic artists themselves. After the same manner, the world, being a statue of the intelligible and perfected by the Father, has indeed some things which are visible indications of its divinity, but others which are the invisible impressions of the participation of being, received by it from the Father, who gave it perfection, in order that through these it may be eternally rooted in real being. Okay, so the term world is the outward-facing cosmos adornment, and then the all heaven label is an indication of the relationship of the world to the divinity which causes it, the thing of real value. Heaven, indeed, and the world are names significant of the powers in the universe. The latter, so far as it proceeds from the intelligible, but the former so far as it is converted to it. It is, however, necessary to know that the divine name of its abiding power, and which is a symbol of the impression of the demiurge, according to which it does not proceed out of being, is ineffable and arcane, and known only to the gods themselves. Okay, it is, however, necessary to know the divine name of its abiding power. So we need to know, that's part of Plato's direct philosophy according to the seventh letter, or maybe second, where he says like there are 5 steps in really knowing something, and knowing like the correct name to call a thing is one of those steps. And we see in the Cratylus as well that there are true names and false names, and the theory of like semantics for Plato is by analogy. So a name naturally means what it is most similar to, or in other words, the names are like images of things themselves. So we need to know that name, and the name is like a statue of the god. And Proclus doesn't invent this metaphor. There's evidence of it in Syrianus as well. Proclus's teacher. But anyway, we need to know the name, according to which it does not proceed out of being, is ineffable and arcane, and known only to the gods themselves. For there are names adapted to every order of things, those indeed that are adapted to divine natures, being divine, to the objects of dianoia, being dianoetic, and to the objects of opinion, doxastic. So names themselves take on the quality of their level of being which they designate. This also Plato says in the Cratylus, where he embraces what is asserted by Homer on this subject, who admits that names of the same things with the gods are different from those that subsist in the opinions of men. Xanthus, by gods, by men called Scamander called, and which the gods Chalcis, men Chimindis call. And both of those instances are referenced in the Cratylus, indicating that there are more scientific and accurate names, and then names that are more kind of mundane, vulgarized. One quality of the more accurate divine names is that they're shorter. So there's brevity, concentrated power, and more unity, which makes sense in Neoplatonic ontology. The higher up you go, the more one, the less manifold. And in a similar manner in many other names. For as the knowledge of the gods is different from that of partial souls, thus also the names of the one are different from those of the other, since divine names unfold the whole essence of the things named, but those of men only partially come into contact with them. Plato, therefore, knowing that this pre-exists in the world, omits the divine and ineffable name itself, which is different from the apparent name, and with the greatest caution introduces it as a symbol of the divine impression which the world contains. I'm actually going to read that again. So since divine names unfold the whole essence of the things named, but those of men only partially come into contact with them, Plato, knowing that this pre-exists in the world, like the true name, I guess, omits the divine and ineffable name itself. So we have 2 names, probably indicating that we're getting approximations of the true thing, but like the name itself, the true name of the world, what it ought to be called, is omitted, which is different from the apparent name, and with the greatest caution introduces it as a symbol of the divine impression which the world contains. With caution introduces the apparent names, the world, and all heaven. These are apparent names and don't capture the fullness of it. And probably also why he says, and whatever else it pleases, or what is the precise quote, whatever other appellation it may be especially adapted to receive. Not indicating that it's irrelevant what we call it, like, oh, whatever name works for the purpose, but instead indicating that these are, oh yeah, he just quotes the exact same lemma. Okay, for the words, or whatever other appellation, and it may receive, are a latent hymn of the mundane name as ineffable, and allotted a divine essence, in order that it may be coordinate to what is signified by it. Because the world as a whole is a god, even the world body, the world soul is a god, the world too is divine. Hence also divine mundane names are delivered by theurgists, some of which are called by them ineffable, but others effable, and some being significant of the invisible powers in the world, but others of the visible elements from which it derives its completion. Through these things, therefore, as hypotheses, the mundane form, the demiurgic cause and paradigm, and the apparent and unapparent name of the world are delivered. And the former name, indeed, is dyadic, but the latter monadic. For the words "whatever other" are significant of oneness. Whatever other is significant of oneness. Why? You'd think that would be otherness. Okay. For the words "whatever other" is significant of oneness, you may also consider the ineffable name of the universe as significant of its abiding in the Father, but the name world as indicative of its progression and heaven of its conversion. So, in some sense, the abiding is the superior of the three phases. All things, of course, abide, proceed, and revert. So we get names equivalent to the progression, the world, and the reversion, all heaven, but we omit the abiding name itself. So the former being the names that are given, the latter, that which is not given, the true name, the name the gods would call it. Okay. So that's something to note. For Proclus, we have these two names being the progression and reversion, and then the unspoken name that it's indicated by whatever other appellation that indicates the unific divine name that correlates to the abiding of the world itself that we don't have. But through the three, you have the final cause, on account of which it is full of good, abiding ineffably, proceeding perfectly, and converting itself to the good as the antecedent object of desire. It is fit, however, to engage in the discussion of the rest of the theory, terminating what follows by the principles. So he's saying, let's not get hung up here. He does that quite a bit, actually. Moving on. Next quote. Next lemma. In the first place, therefore, that as an hypothesis must be considered respecting it, which ought in the beginning to be surveyed about everything. Okay, so in the first place, therefore, that as an hypothesis must be considered respecting it, which ought in the beginning to be surveyed about everything. So what that is, we haven't gotten to in the text. Proclus is probably going to preempt what he's going to say. But as a hypothesis, we need to look at something preliminary about the universe, which is the topic here. So, and Proclus is going to summarize a little bit of what Timaeus has said thus far. So after the prayer, the exhortation to the auditors, and the delivery of the hypotheses, nothing else remains than to dispose the whole discussion conformably to the hypotheses themselves. Of this, however, that head is the leader, whether the world was generated or is unbegotten, having no beginning of generation. For in what was asserted prior to the hypotheses, Timaeus said, "It is necessary that we who are about to speak concerning the universe, whether it was generated or is unbegotten, should invoke the gods and goddesses, as from hence commencing the theory. And in the hypotheses, what that is which is always being, but is without generation, and what that is which is generated, but is never real being, were the things which were first assumed. This, therefore, must be considered first, as it was the first thing supposed in the principles. It is necessary, however, as Socrates says." Okay, so according to the first hypothesis, we're now going to actually look at it. He just mentioned what the basic hypotheses were, which we'd look into about the world. So now we're starting with that most basic. Is it generated or ungenerated? This therefore must be first considered. It is necessary, however, as Socrates says in the Phaedrus, respecting everything, to consider in the first place what it is. But this is the form of the object of investigation, and the generated and the unbegotten, and that's harmonious what we just read in Aristotle, where basically the form of a thing makes it what it is. of course. So the whatness of a thing is the form that it has. This is the form of the object of investigation. And the generated and the unbegotten give distinction to the mundane form. Okay, so to determine the formal property of the world as a whole, we need to know if it's generated or unbegotten. That seems like a stretch on Proclus's part, but maybe that works. So that this is very properly thought to be the first thing that deserves an appropriate consideration, to which also Timaeus immediately after this directs his attention. Okay, but since most of the Platonists understand by the words peri pantos that Plato means about everything, conformably to what is said in the Phaedrus, but Porphyry understands the words as signifying about the universe, it being fit to speak first concerning the universe and to show whether it is naturally unbegotten or generated, it is requisite to know that the former interpretation has in a greater degree the spontaneous. For to assume to pantos for to peri to pantos is a forced assumption. So Porphyry's reading is somewhat contrived, whereas the general consensus is natural, that he's saying where to begin with everything, not about the universe in particular, but beginning with first things first is the basic sense of the lemma. We have to look at what ought to be considered first, and Proclus is saying it is the whatness of a thing, which is okay, we're getting a little bit of echo. I don't know how to address that. I'll listen back to it later and see if I can tweak anything. Okay, let's see. So yeah, the sense of what needs to be examined first for Proclus is the whatness, or the form, essentially, of a thing. And he's saying that it serves to identify the form of the world, to see in what sense it is unbegotten, in what sense it is generated. So rejecting Porphyry's reading, which is specifically about the universe, the first thing to consider is whether it's unbegotten or generated. That, however, these things are simply to be investigated concerning everything we may previously assume from common conceptions and from first hypotheses. The addition also of whether the universe always was, having no beginning of generation, or whether it was generated, shows that what is said is asserted more generally of the universe, for with reference to the world, it is demonstrated that it has a beginning of generation, and that it is visible and tangible, but not with reference to the universe. This, therefore, is manifest. But since it is also necessary to discover in the first place the mundane form, whether it is to be arranged among eternal or among generated natures, this is also consistent with the dialectical method as demonstrated in the Parmenides, the Sophist, the Theaetetus to a lesser extent, and the Statesman, where basically you draw a division of two big categories. You but not universally. Sometimes there's a trichotomy in which something may be placed, but you get to the definition of a thing by drawing these divisions in two in general. So, and then placing the thing in one or the other of these categories. So that's what we're doing here. And one of the biggest dichotomies is generated or ungenerated. Let us see what arguments the philosopher employs and follow him in his demonstrations whether it always was, having no beginning of generation, or was generated from a certain principle, for we shall find that he uses all the dialectical methods in the hypotheses. Thomas Taylor's footnote: as the dialectic of Plato is perfectly scientific, as we have shown in the notes on the Parmenides, and employing the dividing, defining, and analyzing and demonstrative methods, it is evident that instead of dialogiques methodois, in this place we should read dialectiques methodois. Those seem to be identical, but I don't see the difference. This is also evident from what follows. Thus he divides being from that which is generated, and definitively and also analytically assigns what each of them is. So division, diaeresis, is that process of like drawing out the categories that something might fall into. Definition, of course, is giving the genus and differentia of a thing. Analysis is taking a thing and breaking it down into the categories that compose it. That's different from division. Division is starting from the categories and placing the thing. Analysis, so you kind of move from the top down with division, start with the categories, get to the composite thing in question, and then analysis is the reverse. You start with the thing and you break it down into the categories that are involved. So you're moving up generically, whereas with division, you're moving down specifically. Both are kind of similar operations in a certain respect, but one's moving up, one's moving down. That's Damascus's note from the Philebus commentary. And definitively and also analytically assigns what each of them is, for he recurs from generated natures to the demiurgic and paradigmatic causes of them. Moreover, having indicated to us the truth concerning ineffable and effable names, in perfect conformity to the doctrine of Pythagoras, who said that number was the wisest of things, but that he was the next in wisdom who gave names to things, he afterwards converts himself to the demonstration of the problems concerning the world. So, number, I don't know. Where was the number in the Timaeus speech itself? Number was the wisest of things, and then names. So we've addressed, I guess, number sometimes is equated with form, and whether it's generated or ungenerated is maybe related to that question of number. And then the names we get, so we're following that like dictum of Pythagoras. That's just a saying of Pythagoras that's come down, that number is the wisest of things, and then next is he who gives the names. He afterwards converts himself. Yeah, it was like posed as a question to Pythagoras. Like someone asked, this is a saying preserved in Diogenes Laertius of Pythagoras. Someone asks like, what is the wisest of things? And Pythagoras says number, and then after that, he who gives the names. He afterwards converts himself to the demonstration of the problems concerning the world. And so this is where we are. We're actually looking at the first problem in depth. And in the first place, he endeavors to find the form of it and whether it must be admitted to be a portion of perpetual being or of a generated nature. And on this account, he inquires whether it has a certain principle of generation or has none, not asking whether it belongs to eternal beings or to generated natures. For he might have said that it was a medium between both these in the same manner as soul. Right. So is there a principle of generation or not? Rather than which category does it fall into immediately. But he asks whether it always was, having no principle whatever of generation, or whether it was in some way or other generated, in order that he might apprehend the medium between both these to be that which has a certain principle of generation and yet always is. So the ordinary kind of mundane method is to draw out with division the two categories, to place a thing. That's what happens in the statesman and the sophist, and then to continue going down through other categories. But here, it's a medium between these categories, and so instead of just looking where does it fall and picking one or the other, we look at whether it has one of these characteristics as a principle, and then participates of the other in some other manner. But I don't have much more to say on that. Afterwards, having shown that the world is alone generated according to its body, he grants it according to a certain other thing to be unbegotten, according to which also it is a god, as will be evident as we proceed. So, okay, the thing itself, participating of both categories, it has two principles. In according to one of its principles, it is generated. According to another, it's unbegotten, or maybe according to its relation to its principle, it's generated, and according to its own essence, it's unbegotten. But in any case, it kind of makes sense if it's going to fall in both camps in some respect. You have to look to the level above it, its principle, and see where it falls to kind of specify in which respect it falls in each of the camps. Such, therefore, being the inquiry, Plutarch, Atticus, and many other of the Platonists, conceiving the generation here mentioned to be temporal, so he's talking about the middle Platonist Plutarch, not the Plutarch of Athens, who was the teacher of Syrianus, because Plutarch did believe that the world was finite in time and had a beginning in time. Many other of the Platonists, conceiving the generation here mentioned to be temporal, say that the inquiry is whether the world is unbegotten or generated according to time. And that is like a perennial misunderstanding of what Plato's doing here, according to a Neoplatonic interpretation. For they assert that prior to the fabrication of the world, there was a disorderly motion. But time entirely subsists together with motion, so that there was time prior to the universe. Time, however, was also generated together with the universe, being the number of the motion of the universe. So that the former time was prior to the fabrication of the world, being the number of a disorderly motion. But the interpreters of Plato that follow Crantor say that the world is said to be generated as being produced by another cause, and not being self-begotten, nor self-subsistent. And that's, I think, where Proclus falls, more so. And Plotinus, and the philosophers after Plotinus, viz. Porphyry and Iamblichus, say that the composite nature is here called that which is generated, and that with this, generation from another cause is consubsistent. Okay, well, actually, I assume that Proclus will be following the Neoplatonists, but what Crantor says, Proclus has also kind of indicated that in the sense that the universe is suspended from another, it's generated. So once again, the way that the Neoplatonists are portrayed, they say that the composite nature is here called that which is generated, and that with this, generation from another cause is consubsistent. Okay. Yeah. So the being composite indicates that you're generated. So this is specifying the doctrine of Crantor. So first, this is like 3 levels of refinement. First, they're talking about whether this is talking about a creation in time or not. And they say there was a disorderly motion prior to the world, and so time wasn't created with the world or was generated with the world, but there was a former time, a disorganized time, and then a organized time. And then Crantor says it's not with respect to temporal generation, but whether it's suspended from a cause. And then Plotinus and Porphyry and Iamblichus say that being suspended from another cause is the same as saying that something is of a composite nature. And so the world is generated in the sense that it's composed of composite things, like generated objects, although it has no beginning in time. And because it's composite, it is suspended from another cause, and so it's generated in some sense, although not in the strictest sense, in that it has no beginning in time. Generation stricto strictu sensu. I always forget where the U and where the O is. Stricto sensu. JM is not in here. He would know. Let me look that up. Stricto sensu compared to sensu lato. So anyway, generation stricto sensu would be having a beginning in time, but sensu lato would be suspended from another, participating of a composite nature. We, however, say, so he's developing beyond Iamblichus. He considers himself as falling in the school of Syrianus. We don't really know, we don't have evidence of any point on which Proclus actually deviated from Syrianus. We don't have, all we have from Syrianus is his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, which is mostly polemical. So it's hard to say, like, what did Proclus actually innovate? Maybe not that much. So we is the school of Syrianus, and Plutarch of Athens as the precursor to that. But we, however, say that all these assertions are most true. Okay, so some aspect of the time thing, exactly in what sense the world was created in time for Proclus, is very important for later scholarship, and especially the Christian Neoplatonists like John Philoponus. So let's see, all these assertions are most true, and that the world is generated both as a composite and as being indigent of other causes to its existence. So being suspended means not having the cause of one's existence in oneself, in some sense, you could say. So being indigent of other causes to its existence. For everything which has interval is a thing of this kind. So things which have interval, I guess, are of a composite nature, and all of them are suspended from another and are not true ousias. They don't have the cause of their existence in themselves. And that which is sensible is allotted such a nature as this. So all sensible things have interval, all interval things are composite, all composite things are indigent of other causes to their existence, or they are suspended from another. We think it fit, however, that these philosophers should look to other generated natures, I mean time and soul, survey what is common in them, and extend it to these significations, and say that real being indeed is that which eternally possesses a stable essence, power, and energy. But that which is simply or absolutely generated is that which receives all these according to time. And that which is in a certain respect generated possesses its energy in motion and extension. So like soul, for example, the essence of soul is eternal and stable. The energies of soul are in time and fluctuate. For it has been before observed by us that Plato defined the extremes to be that which is simply perpetual being and that which is simply generated. But in what is here said, he comprehends the media. Hence, that which does not possess at once the whole of its essence or energy established in unity is denominated generated. A thing of this kind also entirely subsists through generation, and its existence is generated or becoming to be, but is not real being. This sensible world, likewise, time among things which are moved, and the transitive intelligence of souls are things of this kind. But it is manifest that all motion subsists according to a part, and that the whole of it is not at once. So the motion of the cosmos is always partial. We don't have all of the cosmos at any one time. If, however, the essence of the world has generation, and the perpetuity of it subsists according to temporal infinity, someone, by considering this, may syllogize as follows. So if the essence of the world has generation, and the perpetuity of it subsists according to temporal infinity, if the world being composite is kind of essentially of the nature of generation, but it temporally energizes in perpetuity, then the syllogism is that Proclus is going to argue against, I assume. First, that it is necessary between things that are eternally perpetual and things which are generated in a part of time, the medium should be an hypostasis which is generated infinitely. Okay, so maybe he's agreeing with this because this sounds like the right logic. So, if we know that there are things which are wholly eternal and and then things that only exist for a time, then there should be things that are generated through all time. You have A, you have B, so there has to be something that has A and B. And that this should be twofold, either having the whole perpetual through the whole of time, but the parts in the parts of time, as in the case with these elements, or having both the whole and the parts coextended with the perpetuity of the whole of time, as is the case with the celestial bodies. Right. So there's different manners in which these extremes can be combined. So either the parts can be eternal or the whole can be eternal, having the whole perpetual through the whole of time, but the parts in the parts of time, or having both the whole and the parts coextend with the perpetuity of the whole of time, as is the case with the celestial bodies. Right. Okay. So even sublunary nature is still a medium because the whole of sublunary nature is perpetual through all time, but the parts come and go. So that's like the lesser of the extremes. At the one hand, we have wholly eternal. On the other hand, we have wholly generated. And the media, the higher media, is the celestial bodies, which are partially and wholly perpetual and yet of a generated nature. And then we have the sublunary realm, which is of a generated nature. The whole of it is perpetual through all time, but the parts are not. So those are the necessary two media between those extremes. For there is not the same perpetuity according to eternity and the whole of time, since neither is there the same infinity of time and eternity, because eternity and time are not the same. In the second place, that which is measured by eternity and exists in eternity is necessarily impartible. For how can that which is partible be fixed and have its essence established in the impartible? So time, for how can that which is partible be fixed and have its essence established in the impartible? Let me read this again. That which is measured by eternity and exists in eternity is necessarily impartible. So eternal things can't be partible because the container is impartible. And so there's no, if that's what measures the thing, then there's no parts to establish the parts of the thing in question. So like a geometrical analogy, I guess, like if you have an object that's 10 inches long and your only measure is a 10-inch ruler and it doesn't have subdivisions, you can only measure the whole of that thing. So eternity is like a ruler with no subdivisions. You can only measure the whole impartible thing that is eternal. And so therefore whatever subsists in eternity, measured by eternity, and really like the measurement of a thing is sort of the creation of a thing. That's in the Elements of Theology, but we'll get to that maybe. But yeah, so because the measurement is kind of undifferentiated, the thing measured is impartible. For how can that which is partible be fixed and have its essence established in the impartible? In the third place, that soul energizes according to time, and that body subsists entirely in time. For the energy of soul is nearer to eternal natures than the essence of body. So even though the energy of soul is temporal and not eternal, even that energy of soul is closer to eternal natures than the essence of body. Essence is superior to energy, but body is inferior to soul, so even the energy of soul is superior to the essence of body. What is it then by which we may infer that the essence of the celestial bodies is thus perpetual according to time? It is this, that it cannot be separated from the cause that adorns it. For this makes it evident that it is allotted a renovated perpetuity, and is always generated from a source external to itself. So if it is the case that the energies of time, like discursive reason, are perpetual and are closer to eternal entities, then why should we believe that any corporeal nature, even in its essence, is perpetual? Well, because some celestial bodies are the superior ones, created by superior forces, and so those are constantly renovated by their source. They are not of their nature self-substantial, not kind of essentially perpetual, but they remain in perpetuity because of the goodness of their cause. That's what Timaeus says in the dialogue, right? The universe is, by its nature, destructible, but it will never be destroyed because the demiurge is good, and his nature will never change. So it's allotted a renovated perpetuity, not of its nature perpetual like discursive energies of souls, but it receives that perpetuity from its cause. For if it received the whole of its proper essence from itself, it would be sufficient to itself, separate from that which makes it, and imparts to it essence. But that's not the nature of generated things, that's not the nature of composite things, body, which have interval, and the nature of interval is inherently privatory. So that which makes body body is a lack of form, and so a lack of being. And so no body is going to be, by its essence, eternal and self-sufficient. The intention, indeed, of Plato is to show that the world is simply generated as having its essence, power, and energy, and also its perpetuity coextended with the whole of time. But he inquires from the first whether it is eternal being or belongs to things which are perfected by time, for the expression always was signifies with Plato the intelligible, as we have before observed. So he needs to clarify that by always was, we don't mean that we're dealing with an intelligible, eternal being. If, however, he says further on that the term was is not adapted to eternal natures, but the term is, we must not be disturbed. For prior to a distinction, for prior to a distinct evolution, he follows the accustomed mode of speaking. Right. So before he's like defined how he's using his own terms, he'll use like common parlance. So if there's some contradiction at face value in the way he treats certain terms, well, he uses them according to whether he's established technical usage or not. So sometimes it's common use, sometimes he defines what he means and changes that. Hence also, when celebrating the demiurge, he says, he was good, though the demiurge ranks among eternal natures. And speaking of the paradigm, he collects both these together at once, for he says, the nature of animal itself, therefore, was being eternal, together with aionios, usa, being eternal, assuming to etu gane, was. Okay, the nature of animal itself, therefore, being eternal. And in addition to all that has been said, because the power of every finite body is not infinite, as Aristotle has demonstrated, but eternity is an infinite power, hence every finite body is incapable of receiving eternity. It is necessary, therefore, that it should not be it is necessary, therefore, that it should not always be, but should always be generated, or becoming to be, receiving as much as possible a flowing existence. Okay. Let's do the next paragraph and then wrap up. Being, therefore, as I have said, and perpetual being manifest the eternal. But that which was generated signifies the being allotted and hypostasis measured by time, such as is a sensible nature, which also is apprehended by opinion in conjunction with sense. It has, however, been already said by us that the intelligible is self-subsistent and eternal, but that the sensible nature is produced by something different from itself and is consubsistent with time. For the eternal in number is one thing, and the temporal another. And the former is in number, but the latter is generated in number. So the eternal and temporal are numerically different. The former is in number, is generated in number. So the nature of the being or particular instantiation, one is, the other is becoming. Is being versus becoming, I think is all it's saying. For the former, eternity is conjoined, but to the latter, time. That which is generated likewise, though it is said to be perpetual, has an hypostasis coextended with all time, and which is always generated and always adorned by its producing cause. If, therefore, perpetual being manifests the eternal, but that which has a principle of generation signifies that which is produced by another cause, for such is that which is always generated. But Plato always inquires whether the world always was or has the principle of a certain generation. This being the case, an inquiry of this kind will be the same as an investigation whether the world belongs to eternal natures or to things which are generated according to the whole of time, and whether it belongs to self-subsistent natures or to things which are adorned by another cause. And of course, the cosmos will be adorned by another cause. The cosmos means adornment, in addition to like arrangement. So, all right, and that makes sense also why the demiurge title, like a workman, is so significant for the creation of the physical cosmos. He arranges it. And I guess we'll go ahead and call it. Any comments on the reading today? I feel like we've covered most of this material elsewhere, but if anything was not familiar, or you want to ask questions or any comments, feel free. Okay, well then we'll pick this back up next week. Thanks for participating. Take care.
Thanks. Bye bye.